Yep. All right. Well, we're going to roll then. Okay. So I'm pleased to welcome you to YWCA's 2020 annual meeting. My name is Marguerite Fletcher. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I am proud to be the chair of the YW board. I don't think any of us could have imagined back in April or May that we would still need to be remote this evening. But so thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate everyone attending. So as I said, I'm proud to be the chair of the board at YW Boston. This has been a year filled with heartbreak and with frustration. But sprinkled within that, there have been moments of hope for our community and for our country. It should not take repeated tragedies and a global pandemic to open people's eyes to the racial and gender inequities that so many in this country and community have lived with for far too long. YW has been doing this work for decades, but the reality is that this year's events have led to growing recognition of systemic racism. And thanks to people like you, we've been able to harness this moment to move forward with greater energy and understanding. The generosity of our donors, the time and energy of our board and committees, and the commitment of staff who in short order have had to re-envision how they delivered programming and events this year is why we're having such a strong impact. This evening, we'll be recognizing outgoing and incoming board members. Our board represents the racial, gender, and sector diversity that is so critical to effective decision-making and organizational success. Even internally at YW Boston, it takes hard work and commitment to prioritize equity, but we know that that hard work pays off and leads to success in our organizations and in the larger community. In just a few moments, Beth will share more details about YW Boston's work and programs over the past year. And then we will be hearing from Dr. Candice Nicole Hargons. She will discuss the connection between trauma and racism and how it manifests in the lives of both people of color and people who identify as white. It is the interconnectedness of it all that is so important for us to recognize. One of the powerful things about YW Boston is that it consistently provides access to insightful information that both challenges us and empowers us to continually learn, to be empathetic, to be allies and change agents, and to be inclusive leaders. I know some of you have had the opportunity to participate in programs such as LeadBoston and InclusionBoston. I also hope you're aware of the opportunities available free of cost to everyone, such as Stand Against Racism that we run every April, and the monthly Leader, by Boston's newsletter that comes out in the last week of each month. It's always filled with pertinent content that is responsive to our community's needs and questions. I especially look forward to hearing Beth's thoughts in her monthly feature, Beth's Corner, and to reading articles about things such as how to talk about racism at work, about social identities, and how to be your full self, about what election races will have a major impact on equity in Boston, and how to join public boards and commissions to make your voice and perspectives heard. Along with the annual book list and the maps with women and people of color-owned businesses, YW Boston provides a wealth of information. If you haven't already, I encourage all of you to sign up on our website and follow YW Boston on LinkedIn. I know that Beth will be adding her thanks to mine for all of you and what you do, but I want to take a moment to recognize Beth for leading this organization through this very challenging time. I'm very fortunate to work so closely with this inspirational and humble leader. This is my first year as board chair, but I joined the board in time to participate as Beth expertly guided the organization through a strategic planning process to streamline and rebrand our program offerings. These efforts are paying dividends today with regard to YW's impact and sustainability. It's a pleasure to work with such a strategic leader. As many of you know, last year, YW Boston made the difficult decision to put 140 Clarendon Street on the market. But with the onset of COVID, we saw building sale fall through. We've seen event revenues drop and had to make difficult decisions with limited information about our path forward in these challenging times. However, buoyed by the program demand, the support of individuals, corporations, and foundations, and Beth's steadfast leadership, coupled with the staff and board's confidence in this work, YW Boston is stronger than ever. This year has been made bearable because together, YW Boston staff, board, and you, our supporters and constituents, have shown a strong commitment to lasting change through learning and action. I hope you will take the time to read through our annual report that's been distributed to you electronically. If your name is not on the 2019 list of donors, it's not too late to ensure you'll be on the 2020 list. Our fiscal year ends on December 31st. You are here for us, and we are here for you. As thought partners in this work, your investment and partnership is critical to creating a more equitable Boston. Thank you for your support, and I'll turn it over to Beth.
Hi, everyone. Marguerite, thank you so much for that introduction. And I think as Marguerite shared, this was her first year as our board chair. And what a year to take on such a responsibility. It's hard enough in any year, let alone one with the multiple pandemics we faced. And we just want to say that you really appreciate, and you could see the energy that Marguerite brings and her thoughtfulness as board chair. So thank you. And I would also be remiss if I didn't thank the rest of the board for all of the support they provided to YW this year as well. Again, welcome to everybody. This is one of my favorite times of the being able to, at our annual meeting, really practice gratitude and being able to acknowledge the successes that we've had this year. And those successes, again, wouldn't be possible without you who have supported us. And so even though we can't be gathered together eating hors d'oeuvres and maybe sipping on some wine or soda, we are at least able to gather in Zoom. And again, I can share our accomplishments all because of the support that you provide us. Through my years at YWCA, including the last 3 as president and CEO, I've never felt a deeper sense of gratitude to the YWCA community. It is because of your support that we have been able to continue working toward our mission of eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. If you are new to YWCA or simply need a refresher, we have been doing this work for over 150 years. Through our diversity, equity, and inclusion services, InclusionBoston and LeadBoston, as well as our advocacy work and our F.Y.R.E initiative, we help individuals and organizations change policies, practices, attitudes, and behaviors with a goal of creating more inclusive environments where women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive. Like many of you, YWCA faced a great deal of uncertainty earlier this year. We first felt the impacts of COVID-19 when we had to postpone our Women on the Rise event, which is one of our most popular events of the year. And then as we approached the end of our first quarter, we realized we had no sense of what the rest of the year would hold. We forecasted a dramatic decrease in all of our revenue streams, and we expected few organizations to pursue new diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And even if they did, we did not feel equipped at the time to provide our programs or events completely virtual. But we knew that this was no time to reduce our efforts. COVID-19 laid bare the gaps in our systems, from healthcare to housing, that disproportionately impact women of color, people of color, and women. And in June, we saw the nation rise up following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, as well as countless others, to protest the systemic racism and anti-Blackness that pervade our nation. Again and again, this year made clear the importance of the work that YWCA does. As an organization, we established the guiding principles for moving forward. And with the support of our board, staff, and our 5 organizational values, collaboration, courage, liberation, people, and shared leadership, we carved a path forward. Within a short period of time, we adjusted each of our programs, InclusionBoston, LeadBoston, and the F.Y.R.E initiative, to connect with participants virtually and dynamically. Through InclusionBoston, we engage organizations in long-term partnerships and work with them to create necessary cultural shifts to support inclusive policies and practices. Despite being understaffed at the early onset of COVID-19, our InclusionBoston team worked tirelessly to explore new technologies and forms of engagement. Their hard work set the program up for success when we saw interest increase dramatically for our diversity, equity, and inclusion work over the summer. Another program, LeadBoston, found that providing programming during the pandemic led participants to find community in a trying time. Our 11-month cohort-based program, LeadBoston, meets organizations' demands for more inclusive leadership. The class of 2020 will celebrate their graduation tomorrow, yet they remained committed to the program through the shift to Zoom program days. As many participants have told us, through Lead Boston, they felt more equipped to help their organization center equity and inclusion in response to COVID-19 and systemic anti-Blackness. We also experienced uncertainty when it came to our program, the F.Y.R.E initiative, which launched last fall. F.Y.R.E empowers middle school girls through a curriculum incorporating social justice education, positive identity development, and civic engagement. Similar to our Lead Boston program, the F.Y.R.E initiative provided space for participants to find community and take action during uncertain times. The team has risen to meet any virtual challenges by adapting their workshops, expanding their digital presence to Instagram, and at times convening their groups safely outdoors. Alongside our programs, we continued to provide our community with virtual events on timely topics. For instance, our first webinar featured 2 Lead Boston alums who are community health professionals discussing how we can ensure a more equitable response to COVID-19. And in response to organizations' increased commitment to social equity, we invited our audience to learn about leading with empathy. We have consistently produced content to guide organizations' focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout 2020, including our recent guide on how to foster more inclusive workspaces during the election. As a result, so far this year, we have seen a 100% increase in our mailing list and a 32% increase in people visiting our website to learn from our content, RSVP to our events, and express interest in our programs. We have made it this far because of your commitment to our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. Thank you to our sponsors who remained by our side as we adjusted our events, and to our new corporate sponsors such as IR&M, Acceleron, and Foundation Medicine. I extend special thanks to the many individuals who supported us during these uncertain times. With your confidence in us, we remain vigilant as we look toward 2021. I am proud of the adjustments we made this year, and while optimistic about where our country is headed under new leadership, I know that this work is not going to be done anytime soon, nor will it be easy as we move it forward. We need to sustain our energy in order to address deeply entrenched inequities in our communities, systems, and institutions. In 2021, we will continue to adapt and meet the needs of our community. An excellent example of this is our introduction of an InclusionBoston Gender series. As a result of the COVID-19 crisis, our nation faces a critical moment that will determine the future of women in the workforce. Gendered inequities in the workplace are not new, but if organizations don't deepen their commitment to their women employees now, we may see up to 1/3 of mothers forced out of the workforce. Our InclusionBoston Gender series works with organizations looking to better understand intersectionality, how the binary gender and its construction negatively impacts employees, and how to move toward a shared vision of gender equity. We also look toward 2021 as a year of success in our advocacy initiatives. In order for Massachusetts to appropriately respond to our current crisis, we need diverse leadership. But currently, women, people of color, and women of color are significantly underrepresented in our government and our boards and commissions. We are leading an effort to get a bill passed, H.4153, to require Massachusetts boards and commissions to have racial and gender equity. So we ask you, if you can, to either join our coalition or, better yet, write a letter to House Ways and Means Chair Michaelwitz and encourage him, as well as House Speaker DeLeo, to move the bill forward so it can get voted on this year before the session ends at the end of December. So please reach out to your reps and ask them to do that. It's H4153. You can find it on our Parity on Board website as well. We also have an advocacy committee that is accepting applications if you're interested in joining that work. To meet the demands of the new year, I ask you please both to continue to learn and do whatever you can to further racial and gender equity within your networks, and that you continue to help us meet our fundraising goals so we can continue our work and increase our impact. If you have not already donated this year, I encourage you to do so. For anyone who donates at the $1,000 level today, which is our persimmon level, you will get a YW face mask to wear. And also for anybody that signs up as a donor today, will get one as well. Again, thank you for your support to help us create a more equitable and inclusive Boston. Now I'd like to shift our focus to our exciting keynote speaker. As I spoke about before, we have to remain committed to our work for racial and gender equity. And in doing so, though, it is crucial to recognize that many of us have experienced trauma as a result of the systemic inequities that surround us. Racial trauma is the term used to describe the injury to one's body and mind as a result of continued encounters with racism. In order to be effective leaders, it is important to recognize racial trauma and work towards healing. I am honored to welcome Dr. Candice Nicole Hargons, who will be speaking to you about this topic. Dr. Hargons is the director of the Center for Healing Racial Trauma and is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky's Department of Educational, School, and Counseling Psychology. She is an award-winning counseling psychologist who studies sexual health and healing racial trauma, all with a love ethic. Specifically, her work at the Center for Healing Racial Trauma offers services and trainings designed to heal racially and ethnically marginalized people with love, liberation, equity, and creativity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Candice Nicole Hargons.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm so excited to hear about the wonderful work that's been going on. You have triumphed in this era of COVID, and that is hard to do because many of us are so taxed and so tired. So thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen and jump into this presentation on healing racial trauma with you. So it's important for us to consider that before we get into some work like this, we have to understand that this needs to be experienced mindfully. Very often, depending on how much education you have and how your family system was socialized, you might get socialized out of your body. But healing racial trauma and doing anti-racism work really is a mind-body approach. That's why I take a mindfulness-based approach to it. So we'll start with our SEC check-in. And since I'm in Kentucky, that one is very familiar to those of us who are here, but for you, it may be less familiar. I mean something a little different. First, I'm going to ask you to check in with the sensation. What do you notice in your body? And what does what you notice mean? And this is important because our bodies are our first source of information. Before we had language, before we were able to articulate our emotion or convey our thoughts, very early on, our bodies were the source of communication for us. It let us know when we were feeling something or when we needed something. And in this work, your body is going to give you an indication of how you're receiving this information. So you might notice tension in your shoulders. You might notice a tight jaw, a backache. You might feel that when you walk into a room and you are the only person of color there, that you're holding your breath. These are sensations that you want to pay attention to. And you want to also think about what is what you notice mean. And then we'll move to emotion. So what emotions come up for you and what do you do with them? So as I named, depending on your community setting, your work setting, your family setting, some of us have been asked to suppress emotion, especially as it relates to racism, to pretend like things don't affect us, that we're not angry, that we're not sad, that we're not disappointed, that we're not hurt, or that we're not ashamed, or that we're not embarrassed, or whatever might come up as you do this. So I want to ask you to pay attention to your emotion, not judging them, but to give them some time to surface and not suppress them so that you can really allow this work to internalize. And then lastly, I'll ask you about cognition. What are you thinking, but also what are you trying not to think? So what we're thinking is important because it gives us a pathway to understand what our behaviors might be as an outcome of our thoughts or our emotions or our sensations. But what we're trying not to think is informative as well, because we've been socialized in this system around racism. And so when we start to unpack what racism is, what it means, how it functions, There are things that we would like not to be thinking that sometimes surface. So I want you to pay attention to both, not judging them, but just holding them in your awareness for a moment and then letting them come and go. So I'll return to the SEC model as we walk through our training. And I begin with what is racism. I love Kamara Jones's definition of racism. She was a past president of the American Public Health Association, a Black woman, and she framed racism very clearly as three parts. Most of us learn about that middle part, personally mediated. Very early on, we think racism is just about how people treat other people, whether you're nice to people of a different race, whether or not you respect people or like people of a different race. But it's really more than that. And many of you doing the work that you've been doing at the YWCA understand that at first and foremost, racism is institutionalized. That means that if you live in a community that is predominantly white on unceded indigenous lands, then that's a function of institutionalized racism. If you work in a setting that is primarily white people, then that's a function of institutionalized racism. So many times we are experiencing the effects of institutionalized racism without the name for it or the understanding of where it comes from and why it impacts us. Then institutionalized racism leads to personally mediated racism. And so personally mediated racism includes microaggressions, and many of us have experienced them where someone makes a remark or does a gesture that suggests that you are dangerous or you are angry or you are unapproachable or you are stupid. Anything that might be dehumanizing based on your marginalized racial identity, that's personally mediated racism. And so that's commonly what people think of when they think about racism, but it's so much more than that. And that last stage of racism is internalized. This is the one that gets less airtime because internalized racism is really when people of color, people with racially and ethnically marginalized identities, people of the global majority begin to believe or identify with some of these racist stereotypes, some of these negative messages or cultural norms that serve to operate or privilege people who are white. That's internalized racism. All three of these levels are very frequently operating in our systems, in our society, and in ourselves. And so it's important that we think about racism comprehensively when we think about how to heal racial trauma, because it has to happen at all of those levels. So very often people ask me, who is racist then? If we understand these systems of oppression and how they operate together, I love Ibram Kendi's work. One of my favorite books of the year is Stamped from the Beginning. So if you haven't already read it, I suggest that you get it and read it. I've listened to it on Audible and I share it with most of the people that I train or do talks for because it is a comprehensive exploration of how racist ideas came to be in the United States of America and how they function. And so by his articulation, white people developed this institutional racism to hoard resources, to co-opt resources using colonization, using imperialism, using genocide, using policy, practice, all of those levels. But it wasn't intended initially to be about race. Personally mediated racism was what was developed as an outcome of these institutionalized racism practices, because to dehumanize someone so that you can exploit their resources, you have to start to develop language around how they're not worthy of those resources, how they're undeserving, how they're not quite human, how they're not quite lovable. All of those aspects are how personally mediated racism came to be. And what you find is that not only do white people perpetuate personally mediated racism, but marginalized racial groups very often perpetuate personally mediated racism to others within marginalized racial groups or others within their own communities. And then we have internalized racism, which is a function of personally mediated racism. What that suggests is that after you have interfaced with and dealt with and handled and had to navigate and strategize through all of these systems of racism and oppression, some of that velcros to you. Some of that gets stuck in you in the way you think about yourself, the way you raise your children, the way you tell people how to wear their hair or what type of language style, what vernacular is professional and what is not. And so you'll find that there's the definition of personally mediated racism then showing up in how you think about yourself. So that's when we understand who is racist and how that functions. We want to see this movement that it can be all of us who have a part to play in undoing and healing racial trauma. And why do we do it? We do this work because it leads to race-based stress and racial trauma. Race-based stress starts with a racist stressor. That means the microaggression, or that means walking into a room and being the only person of color there and feeling like, how am I going to have to navigate this system today? Those pieces are racist stressors, having to decide what school you send your child to and whether they will receive a quality education and love and respect for their cultural identity, or just one or the other. Those are racist stressors. And so those racist stressors, this section right here, is where preventing racial trauma can happen. So anti-racist work really serves to prevent the racist stressors from even happening by improving awareness and skills around how we engage and dismantle systems of racism. That's where the work for white allies and accomplices is really profound, because people who benefit from systems of racism really have a lot of power in preventing it from happening in the first place. But we live in an imperfect world. We live in a world that's steeped in this. And so very often those racist stressors do occur, and they lead to race-based stress reactions. Those reactions are what you feel in your body when you find that you're holding your breath through a meeting after someone microaggresses you, or they experience in your emotions where you feel enraged when you hear about or watch another person of color be murdered on public television. Or it might be numbness, even where you've seen so much of it and heard so much of it that you just stop feeling, that you just develop a shroud of apathy to protect yourself from having to feel anything. But it also comes up in our thoughts, how we think about ourselves, those intentional code switching moves we make, how we navigate systems immediately in the moment when something racist happens. Those are race-based stress reactions. The more long-standing versions of those are race-based stress symptoms. So that's not just what happens in that moment where you're interfaced with something that's a racist stressor, but how after the day or two after it's passed, it's still sitting with you. You're still feeling that emotionally. You start to feel like you're hypervigilant, or you notice or paying close attention to what's around you and how people are acting, and maybe noticing if there are racist dynamics around you more. You might even feel like you begin to feel depressive symptoms. So maybe you feel like you can't concentrate as much, or you get exhausted more often. All of those are function of race-based stress symptoms. And it can lead to racial trauma. So those are the enduring, long-standing, intense symptoms. And very often the stuff we think about, these negative mortality outcomes for women of color when you are experiencing childbirth, that's a racial trauma. That's a function of racial trauma. High blood pressure. Things that are physical outcomes now are beginning to be understood as a function of racial trauma, and not just bad health decisions as it has been painted before. So racial trauma is the experience of enduring cognitive, affective, and or somatic responses to racism. And they manifest based on either the intensity or the frequency of the racist stressor. So very often you might not be experiencing really intense racist stressors, but maybe frequently you're experiencing microaggressions. That can still lead to racial trauma. Or maybe you have been in a safe haven in your life where you're surrounded by people who are allies or people of color who get it. And so you don't experience those day-to-day insults, but then you see that Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home. And that intense vicarious racist stressor leads to racial trauma. So not every racist stressor does lead to it, but those that are especially intense or frequent do. And when you have an absence of a repertoire of coping strategies, that's more likely to increase the progression from race-based stress to racial trauma. So even if you have a good coping repertoire, a good care praxis, if you over-rely on one type, you're not likely to be able to prevent that racial trauma from happening. And it's also important to note that it's not solely the responsibility of the people who are injured, of the global majority or people who are marginalized racially and ethnically to heal themselves, because we know that healthcare resources and coping resources are not distributed proportionately or equitably. But it still does bear saying that individually and collectively coping, resisting, and healing facilitates racial healing. And so healing racial trauma is a comprehensive intervention on multiple components, all of those levels of racism. So I want you to check in with your body again. And you can use the chat to just write, what do you notice in your body as you hear this information? Not your emotion just yet, but your body. What sensation do you notice in your body? Did your stomach drop? Were you holding your breath? Did you have a headache, or did you start to feel relief in your body? Did your jaw loosen? Did your shoulders release? Did you feel less tension? You can use the chat, or you can just think to yourself what sensations you notice in your body as you receive this information. Harder to breathe. Absolutely. And so take a deep breath. Give yourself room to really inhale and breathe it in. Head feels tight. Yes. Yes, taking deep breaths. Absolutely. Collarbones feel too close together. Yes. You might find that you've been operating like this all day. Let them go. Clenching jaw, hunching over. Absolutely. And so, what about your emotion? Think about what emotions come up for you as you hear this information. So many emotions. And I always mention that the function of anti-racism training is not, in the way I do it, to cultivate guilt and shame, because I think guilt and shame paralyze you from taking good action. It's really for you to release that guilt and shame so that you can start to speak truth to power, start to take action, start to understand all of the different ways of being white in this world, all of the different ways of being a person of color in this world, and how we can use that to really do this healing racial trauma work collectively. Yes, absolutely. Feeling unsafe, relief that there was a name to what you were experiencing. Yes, feeling hurt, surrendering to the truth. Thank you so much for sharing that. So as we walk through, for those of you who identify as white, what comes up for you somatically and emotionally, the sensations in your body, it's important that I use, and she's out there with you in Boston, Janet Helms's White Racial Identity Development Model. I love it because it captures that there are so many ways to show up as a white person, and many of them can be working towards anti-racism, but some of them are not. And you might see this in yourself, some of these stages throughout your journey. You might see this in some of your family members. But I like to walk through the first stage, which is contact. And this is where you're oblivious to racism. Many of you who identify as white showed up oblivious until this year. You might have had a lack of understanding of racism because of minimal experiences with people of color. As a function of institutionalized racism, maybe you didn't have a chance to be in relationship or community with people of color. And you might even profess to be colorblind, which we're releasing this year, and we're letting that go. So you might consciously or unconsciously believe in white superiority. That's a person in the contact stage. But then inevitably, you experience a racial moral dilemma. This year presented 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a plethora of them for many white people. And so you begin to have this conflict over what you see as a racial inequity or a racist incident. You believe you're not racist, but you also kind of don't want your child to marry a person of color. So you witness oppression, but maybe you choose not to acknowledge it. You don't know what to do with it, but it's that first time that you realize you're white and that has some social capital. So what we see is that there are 2 divergent points that this can take. White people can go to one area where they begin to develop an anti-racist mindset, or they can go to another pathway. And you might find yourself circling through these because it does look linear, but it really isn't. That reintegration phase is where you see some people going. You resolve your cognitive dissonance by idealizing whiteness and belittling people of color. This is where you see folks blame people of color for all of the problems they face, consciously endorsing a belief in white superiority, and they double down in racism. They really hold tight to it. That's a reintegration phase. But there's another way. Some of you might be in the pseudo independence phase, where you have had this insightful or painful encounter seeing a racist inequity, and then you start to attempt to understand racial differences and appreciate them. You start to reach out and interact with people of color, but you're probably still in a place where you only interact with the ones who seem similar to you on other shared privileged identities. You have an intellectual understanding of racism and privilege. Maybe you have started to have a grasp of the language. You'll see a lot of anger in the reintegration and pseudo independence stages, but for different reasons. You'll see people really wanting to resist and stand up. So it's a great start to the work, but it's not the end point. That next phase is immersion, where you are reinforced to continue your personal exploration as a white person. You seek to understand how you benefit from racism. So you're not pointing the finger at other white people out there in the world, like your family members or your cousins who are doing it wrong. You're starting to reflect on yourself. When have I hurt someone? When have I harmed someone? How do I show up at work? Do I enact allyship? You're willing to name and confront your own biases, and you experientially and effectively in your body and in your mind start to understand racism. And that last stage, which is really tough to get to in a world that continues to socialize us in racism, is where you feel reduced feelings of guilt. And you start to understand whiteness as one of many systems of interlocking oppression and privilege. And you're determined to dismantle that system. So you start to relinquish some of those white entitlements and you increase your knowledge. You become less fearful and less uncomfortable about race, and less afraid to have those conversations. There's also stages for people of color. And so I like to walk through this because we're not a monolith, just like white people are not a monolith. In the beginning, many of us absorbed beliefs about white culture and began to believe that white is right and black is wrong, and everything on the spectrum from indigenous to Asian to Latinx was gradated, appropriate or not. We start to de-emphasize our racial group membership, and we become unaware because we go to similar schools who socialize us. And then we experience an encounter. And so we're forced by whatever series of events or specific events to recognize that we are not white and will not be white. And you start to develop your identity as a person of color and what it means to be targeted by racism. When you go into the immersion or immersion stage as a person of color, this is where you really wanted to surround yourself by visible symbols of your racial identity, actively in avoiding whiteness, really learning about your history, your culture, digging down into that. And you have a righteous anger at inequity and misinformation, but also some shame about your past ignorance, maybe some of the ways your internalized racism showed up. And as you move through your racial identity development, you go into the internalization stage where you are secure in your own sense of your racial identity. You start to develop your pro people of color attitudes, become less defensive, and maybe you might even be willing to reestablish relationships with some white people who actually understand their own white identity and are doing the allyship and advocacy work. And in our final stage, you find ways to translate your personal sense of racial identity into a plan of action. You start to commit to unpacking and dismantling systems of racism. And you have comfort in your race and who you are as a racial being, but you recognize that it's not a stereotyped, prescribed way of being a person of color. You can hold joy and anger at the same time, because very often we're confronted with having to do both. And you understand these intersections of oppression. So whereas you may be racially marginalized, maybe in other ways you have a ton of privilege. And this is Cross's model that I love. So here are some of the things that get in the way of cultivating an anti-racist mindset: fear, fatigue, and not giving a. So very often, many of us are afraid. And we have life fears, livelihood fears, and luxury fears. Those life fears are, will I lose my life, or the people within my care lose their lives, or put our bodies on the line? Will we be injured, physically harmed by doing this anti-racist work? Many of us have had to face that. People who are on the front lines and protest face it every day. We know people by name who've been assassinated doing anti-racist work. But then there are livelihood fears. So are you willing to lose your job, your ability to provide resources for yourself or the people within your care, to not be promoted, to be um, let go at your place of employment? Those are real fears that people are holding when they think about whether they'll speak up, whether they will do this work or not. And then there are luxury fears. And that's not to say that, oh, you shouldn't be afraid of them. They still feel terrible. But that includes things like not being invited to brunch anymore, or people getting quiet when you walk in the room, or making other folks uncomfortable. Those are luxury fears. They still feel quite uncomfortable. Your body processes them in the same way, but they're not the same as life fears and livelihood fears. What also gets in the way is fatigue. How many of us are tired? Just put a yes in the chat if this year has worn you out. And very often, yes, tired, not even just tired. Yes. So fatigue is real. Fatigue can really be a barrier to us doing anti-racist work, cultivating an anti-racist mindset. And it's so real. I see tons of yeses in the chat because of how that resonates with us. We're tired. Racial battle fatigue is real. Work life fatigue is real. COVID-19 fatigue is real. We are drained. Zoom fatigue, even. But there are 4 care practices that I always offer to us to think about how you work through that fatigue so you can stay in the game. Because rest is important, but don't quit. So you might be numbing, self-care, collective care, or soul care. People think self-care is sitting in front of Netflix for 10 hours, but it's not. Numbing is what that's called. So anything binge eating, binge drinking, binge shopping, because some of you are doing too much on Amazon and you know it. Binge Netflix, binge social media, anything binge, anything binge is so that you won't feel. And let's be honest, you need a little bit of numbing in the world because sometimes it's so painful that you need a moment where you don't feel. It's just that we don't want to over rely on numbing. Self-care is what you do for and with yourself. That's therapy. That is going for a hike. I mean, that's going for a walk. That's making sure that you do your exercise and eat right and get sleep, journal. All of those pieces are self-care. And then collective care is what you do with and for others. And so that includes hanging out with your family, getting some cuddle time if your family is who you enjoy being with, loved ones. It can also include engaging in resistance or protest if that's your jam. Collective care is a part of that. You need that. And then soul care is what reminds you that you are a part of something greater. For some of you who identify with a religious tradition, it could be prayer or meditation, mantra. For some of you, it could be hiking or being in nature, connecting with an idea that it's bigger than mind and body, that you're a part of something greater. That's soul care. That's how you keep yourself in the game. And then lastly, not giving a, this is where we really need white allies. Those of you who identify as white, some of you believe the world is just as it is. It's just fine. And we need white allies to come in and stay in the game. So don't give your cousins up. Don't go home for the holidays and start blocking people on social media. No, we need you to stay in the game with them because people of color can't do that work. That's too exhausting for us when they might be facing annihilation. We need white people who are really intent on staying in the game with their family members, showing up, being visible as an ally. Some people don't care because it doesn't affect their lives. And some of us have had so much trauma that you can't bear to empathize with others. Those are the things that get in the way. But here are the things that help us move past it. These are our starter steps. First, consume research, books, news, and media created by humans with racially and ethnically marginalized identities. Do your reading clubs. Make sure you diversify your social media, follow people with marginalized identities, learn from them and their lived experiences so that you are not overtaxing the people of color in your life by asking for uncompensated emotional labor. That's important. Number 2, own it and accept it when you do something without deflecting or making it about tending to your feelings. Speak up when you see something or hear something without expecting to feel safe or comfortable. We know safety is a social construct and so is comfort. Most people of color don't feel safe or comfortable anywhere. And so you have to be able to give some of that up when you do something that's harmful or hurtful so that you can learn and grow from it. Number 3, be willing to use your seat at the table, even if it may cost you your seat. So we don't want to power hoard when we get to these board positions and these chair positions when you have some power in your system. You want to think about policy change as critical. So develop and use your capacity to evaluate policy from an anti-racist lens. Number 4, establish authentic relationships with people of color built on care and mutual respect. So don't go in thinking you're saving anybody. Go in thinking you're being in solidarity, building real relationships, honoring tradition, culture, understanding, and being in community in a way where we all benefit. And lastly, when you're stuck, because we all get stuck, you want to start with empathy and humility. That you don't know everything and you won't be perfect at it, and that's okay. And that you can connect with the human emotion before you connect with anything if you allow yourself to. So, as you check in with your sensations, emotions, and cognitions, I just want to say thank you for listening. I appreciate your engagement in the chat. And now I'm opening it up for questions and discussion.
Oh, can't find my thing. I will join in a second. There I go. So, Dr. Candice, Nicole, thank you so much. There was just so much there to take in. Many of my questions you answered, but I do have a couple. And if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to those as well. You mentioned some of I was wondering if you could share some more strategies for effectively coping as a BIPOC person. Trauma.
Absolutely. So one, I always lead with therapy because I'm a licensed psychologist, and that get you a therapist who understands racism and racial trauma and how that affects your emotional world and how you show up, how that affects your interpersonal processes and how you have to navigate systems. Because having that weekly or bi-weekly really makes a difference to how you live the rest of the week. But also journaling. So journaling about your experiences and not suppressing it or carrying it on yourself, having community with people of color who get it without you having to explain 400 years of oppression before they get it is necessary. Doing those pieces like meditation, for me, meditation is a big part of my wellness practice, my care practice. It's helpful because it grounds me in what my body is telling me, what my intuition is telling me, what my emotions are, and in a way that I don't judge them or try to shape them around making other people comfortable, but to really attend to them. So those are some of the strategies that I love to use.
And any suggestions, because it is very difficult to find therapists of color. And so any suggestions for people that might be listening on, or are there websites to go to find folks just to help, because there just aren't many?
My fave is Therapy for Black Girls. Therapy for Black Girls is a directory for all of the United States, and they might have some international ones actually, but that has over hundreds of psychologists, social workers, licensed professional counselors, marriage therapists, all of that. And they are largely people of color, but not exclusively, largely women, but not exclusively. And so you might find someone in your area who could work with you.
Great, thank you. Now, and you shared both for people who identify as white and people who identify as people of color, sort of the identity trajectory. And so, as you mentioned, as we get closer to the holidays, although with COVID-19, it's unclear how often we might really be with our families, but we are getting together with family members and we may be in different places on that journey. Any strategies to think about how do we engage in what could be uncomfortable or challenging conversations? How do we both, for those who identify as white, be able to stay in that conversation, and for those who identify as people of color, and particularly Black and Latinx, how do we stay in those conversations?
Yeah. So for white people, I would suggest that you don't go into it without cultural humility. Go into it recognizing that you too cause harm, so that you don't go in and just try to lambaste your cousins like you've been racist this whole time, and that's hurtful to them, and they might be, but also you. So if you recognize that you have that piece too, identify with how long it takes for adults to learn stuff and be patient, because you and your privilege have the room to be patient. You have the room to be with your cousins and say, this is how I show up in the world. This is why this is important to me, as opposed to arguing about it and trying to prove a point. Showcase why it's valuable for you. Showcase why it means something to you to be aligned with anti-racist movements. So when you do it in that way, by demonstrating what's valuable about it in your life, as opposed to imposing it on someone else, I think it makes a difference to how you keep community going and how people can learn from you, even if you're not teaching, if that makes sense. For people of color, I always say you don't owe anybody education or training. So that is what I do for pay. You hire the experts to do that, because that uncompensated labor can lead to racial battle fatigue. And so if you have members of your family who might have internalized racism, or members of your family who engage or enact racism or other aspects of oppression, you might need to just go. You might need to find loved ones or a family of choice who can hold your humanity, who can love you as is. I always say that when it's your marginalized or oppressed identity, it's too much to bear to have to keep interfacing with that type of pain. That's for people who have the privilege and who should develop the grit to stay in the game with that.
Well, you may be getting a lot of invitations now for Thanksgiving dinner. Zooms. Another
I
question.
want to say, yes, Dr. Thema is amazing. I love her work. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing you didn't talk about in this presentation, but I heard you talk about previously, was the apology language. And I was wondering if you could touch on that, because I think for some people, they're so afraid of making a mistake.
Yes.
They want to engage in these conversations and in this work, that fear of a mistake prevents them. So if you could talk a little about the apology language.
I have to pull it up so I can make sure I get the name for each one right, because this is actually based off the work of Gary Chapman, and it's about romantic relationships and marriages typically, but it applies to this work because the intimacy that is required for you to have a conversation when you have harmed someone really requires a different type of apology style. So there's 5 distinct apology types. And it's important to ask the person who you might have harmed how they would benefit from your apology, because very often you're afraid to get it wrong and you do nothing, and that hurts more. And so when you ask about, here is what I can do, here's what I want to do, it gives them an opportunity to say, this is how you make it right with me. So there are 5 types. Expressing regret, which is just to say, I'm sorry. You express regret that you did it, that you caused that harm. However, accepting responsibility, which is another type, is to say, I was wrong. That's my favorite. I love a good, I was wrong. And very often people want a little step further, which is making restitution. What can I do to make it right? So sometimes people don't want your apology. They just want you to ask them, what can I do to make it right? And maybe your action, you're making restitution, is the thing that benefits them or feels like a true apology. And then you have genuinely repenting. I'll try not to do that again. This is another favorite of mine, because I don't want to also hear that you were wrong and that you're going to continue to be injurious and wrong. I want to know that you are going to try and make an attempt, and that it's important to you to try not to do it again. And then requesting forgiveness. That's another apology language. Will you please forgive me? So inviting that person, being humble enough to invite that person to forgive you, and to see if they say yes or no, and to be okay with either one. So for some people, they might want one. Sometimes you use a blend, but you can ask, there are all of these ways that I can apologize. What one really resonates with you? And someone might say, actually, I just wanted to hear that you thought it was worthy of an apology, and that's enough. And other people might be like, you can donate to this organization, because that would be the type of restitution that shows me that you're invested and you're putting your money where your mouth is. So it depends.
Right. That's great. That's really helpful. And then in some cases, somebody may not be ready for an apology, but that doesn't mean you don't try, you don't ask, and you can go back, right? I want to open up to see if anybody in our audience has any questions, so that I can make sure they have an opportunity to ask as well. So somebody asked for the source of the apology language.
It's called The 5 Languages of Apology. And like I said, this is not applied to anti-racism work. This is applied to relationship context, but it's relevant. And I translate it in that way because I think it's really relevant. So it's by Gary Chapman and Jennifer Thomas.
Mhm. And so one thing I would be interested to know, and please, if other folks have questions, what got you into this work? Because this isn't a field that it's become, I hear more about this field now, but it wasn't something I heard a lot of before. So I'd love to hear how you got engaged.
Right. So living in the world as a Black woman was probably the introduction into the necessity for this work. And I went to Spelman College. So I was introduced to a world for 4 years where all of the language for the experiences I had had from 0 to 18 was presented to me. Wow, there has been research about this. There's a name for this. That is very validating. And so I think that was the entry point for me, but I didn't see it as a career path until I was training to be a psychologist. And I actually was training, so I wanted to be a sex therapist. And during my training, Trayvon Martin was murdered. And during my training, the Charleston massacre happened. And I was like, I'm learning all these healing skills and learning about all these constructs. How do we apply them to racial trauma? Because I'm suffering, people I know are suffering. I'm watching it happen, and it's not being applied therapeutically in my training settings. It was happening in psychology, but just not in the training settings I was in. And so for me, living in a state like Kentucky, it just became so clear to me that this would be useful for the people who were here. And so I developed the Center for Healing Racial Trauma because I wanted to do that therapy work. But I said that the prevention work is core because I don't want to just do therapy work so we go back into the world and feel harmed every day. But the prevention work with these organizations and these systems is so essential so that maybe they can reduce the amount of harm that we have to engage with.
Thank you. So we have a question around how do you support young Black children? And I think particularly speaking to parents, knowing that, as soon as you enter this world, that you're being, and even when you're in the womb, you're being impacted by this, let alone when you enter. So how can you help build the resilience, particularly of Black children in
There's this,
this?
oh yeah, there's a process for name for it called racial socialization. And there are components to it where you want to develop their pride in their race and their identity. So a part of the way you do that is what kind of media do they engage with? What kind of books? So when I think about my son who's almost 2, 9 out of 10 of his books have little Black girls and boys, because that's important that when he's reading Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, it's from a face that looks like him. When I think about that developing who in his history, who in his legacy of all of the Black diaspora is important and brilliant and worthy, we name those names. We do that. We introduce him to those concepts really early on. But also, you want to think about really giving kids an idea of how the world might treat them so that you can prepare them. And a lot of people hate that part of the process because they feel like it takes away some of the innocence, but it's both protective and it does reduce some of that mystery about the world. But I frame it as these are lies that people might believe about you, really emphasizing that they're not true. Stereotypes are lies about them. And because they believe lies, they might treat you this way. But remember who you are. Remember that you're brilliant and that you're lovable and that you're bright. So affirming those messages with your children consistently, affirming the hair that grows out of their scalp, affirming whatever complexion their skin comes in and their facial features and their body types. All of those pieces are core to building a sense of self that can stand in the face of racism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You also shared in your presentation that there are strategies to try to avoid racist stressors. So what are some of the things that we can do, whether as Black people or people of color, as white people, to avoid stressors in the first place?
Right. I said that because I believe that they can be prevented if white people who identify as allies and accomplices get on board and do that work. I don't think they can be avoided in our lifetime. Okay. So I think that we're gonna interface with racism throughout our lifetime. And that's a reality that we have to sit with, like I said, holding the joy and the pain. that there are beautiful and wonderful things about being people of color. And we know this and we can remind ourselves of this, but we're not at a place in our history where we'll see racism eliminated in this generation. We're just actively working on it. So I don't think we can avoid it per se. I think that we can create spaces where it's less likely to interfere with our lives.
Okay. And we have a question around, I think ultimately, how do we make peace when we've been wronged? So somebody said that they lost their job because they advocated for Black and brown students, and then they were gaslighted about that work. And so, you know, for many people, and particularly Black and brown people, there is anger, right? And so how do you not let the anger overcome you and get in the way of moving forward?
Don't pretend like you're not angry. I think your anger is valid and it's a catalyst for action very often. It's just that you don't want it to organize all of your behaviors. So if you feel angry, let yourself feel angry for a while. Usually there's a lot of hurt under anger, but anger too. So express your anger in ways that feel necessary for you. For me, I have a journal where I write down like cuss out messages and things that I would have told someone. You know, emails. It's called, I really created this journal for Black women. It is called First of All. And so you just have like little place where you can humorously, but really unpack the anger that you're feeling, because it's important. So I never pretend that anger hasn't served us in a lot of these racial justice movements, but you don't want it to organize all of your behavior. So you don't want to be reacting to anger without time to process it. So give yourself the time to process it. And that goes back to having therapeutic spaces, listening to music that feels validating for you, rewarding for you, uplifting for you, crying if you need to. You know, those pieces are essential to not letting it erode you from the inside out.
So there was a comment on workers' compensation for people who have experienced racial trauma. So just your thoughts on how one could even think about, you know, approaching that if to make that a reality.
There are some forensic psychologists who do that. So I think about Robert Carter's work at Columbia. He's one of the people who coined the term racial trauma back in 2005, maybe I think probably around that time. But I think he does forensic psychology work. That means that if you create an EEO case or something, he might be a person that you can invite to speak on how that racial trauma has impacted you, how that can lead to disability and all of those pieces. So there are people who do that. I don't, but there are people who do that.
Okay. And I'm going to see if there's one more question, and then if not, I will give you the opportunity. Is there anything you would like to, you know, leave our audience with?
Let me say that the journal, can I share the journal? Is that okay? Somebody said that is something that they wanted to see. I'll see if I can drop it in the chat for us. But just that you are worthy. You always have been and always will be, especially if you identify as a person with racially or ethnically marginalized identities. You're the global majority. And it really doesn't seem like that when you live in the United States of America, but only 14% of this globe identify as white. And so if you're a person of color, you really are the global majority. And there's a lot of power in knowing that there are numbers. There's a lot of power in recognizing that there is a whole legacy and history and heritage that very often we don't get introduced to until much later in life. So start learning about that and recognizing that when you trust in your worthiness, you start to operate in ways that help liberate you. And for those of you who identify as white, really letting go of the guilt and shame of the harm that you likely have caused in the past so that you can activate yourself as an ally or accomplice in this work, because we benefit from doing this collectively. It can be done exclusively by people of color. It can be done exclusively by white people. But if we have an opportunity to do it in concert with each other, why not?
That's great. So Dr. Candice Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, as many of the comments said, what you shared with us was extraordinarily powerful. And again, we're just really appreciative of what you said and the work that you do. And now I'll ask Marguerite to come back on.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Dr. Nicole. That was just amazing, really wonderful. Thank you for joining us this evening and for sharing your wisdom with us. Really appreciate it. Ooh, looks like she's put that journal in the chat, so really check that out. All right, so I have the pleasure now of welcoming our 3 new board members. Our 2021 Board of Directors will have 19 members. I serve as the chair. Julia Lanham is returning as vice chair. Susanna Baer is returning as treasurer. And our new clerk for 2021 will be Robin Van Ricka. And I do want to thank now April English for being our clerk last year. Thankfully, she is staying on the board as well. So we will continue to have her wisdom and dedication to our board. I also want to thank the governance committee, and particularly Alona Abalos, our governance committee chair. She has just been amazing. And thanks to their hard work, we are thrilled to welcome 3 candidates who bring diverse skills and perspectives to YW Boston. So first is Chris Escobado Hart. So let me just tell you a few things about Chris. He's a partner and co-chair of the privacy and data security practice at Foley Hoag. He has significant trial litigation, appellate advocacy, and data privacy and security experience. He's counseled and represented sovereign nations, Fortune 500 companies, startup companies, nonprofits, and individuals in a wide variety of contexts for over a decade. Chris is also very committed to pro bono work and to serving the Boston community. He's fluent in Spanish and has represented numerous immigrants from South and Central America in navigating U.S. federal immigration law in federal court and before asylum officers. He represents individuals in Boston Housing Court and regularly staffs a civil appeals clinic in Boston. He also offers pro bono support to nonprofits in need of counsel on data privacy, utilizing his proficiency in this area. Chris also currently serves as a member of the firm's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, and he's also the co-chair of the Boston Bar Association's DE&I section. So Chris, we're really happy to welcome you to the board. Thank you so much for joining us. The next board member that I'd like to welcome is Bae Esmien Jimenez. She's the Director of Economic Opportunity at the Boston Chamber of Commerce. An urban planning professional and writer based in Boston, she holds a master's in city planning from Boston University. She was born in the Dominican Republic and grew up in Lawrence, Mass. Her writing is dedicated to issues surrounding social justice, housing, and intersectionality. She's documented her experiences abroad through her blog, Street Art Plus Food. Her work has also been featured in the Boston Globe, Black Girl in Ohm, Travel Noir, Femme Travel, Grub Street's Tell All, and independently on Medium. She's also directed an independent short film, Here for Us, Here to Stay, with Wendy Media for the Conservation Law Foundation, focused on climate action awareness. Bae has also served on YW Boston's Advocacy Committee and the Academy of Women Achievers Host Committee. So we thank her for all she has already done for YW Boston and really appreciate that she's willing to step up even more and join our board. Thank you so much, Bae. And then last but definitely not least, Sharifa Niles Lane. Sharifa is the Vice President of Digital Marketing and Social Media Manager at Eastern Bank, the oldest and largest mutual bank in the country. Sharifa brings 15 years of digital and content marketing experience and a proven track record of success to the bank. Prior to joining Eastern Bank, Sharifa has held roles in leading digital marketing and social media strategy at Liberty Mutual Insurance, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and John Hancock, where she won various industry awards for her outstanding work and demonstrated expertise. Over the years, Sharifa has been instrumental in leading strategies and campaigns for many brands and partnerships such as Showtime, Universal Music, Decca, the Oprah Winfrey Show, No Phone Zone campaign, the Boston Marathon, Curious George, and most recently, Eastern Bank's social media strategy with David Ortiz. She has a passion for mentorship and community service and currently serves on the board of advisors for the Greater Boston YMCA Dorchester and the City Year 7 Generations Board. We are thrilled to welcome her to YW Boston's board. So really excited, and I wish we were all together and we could all, you know what, maybe just wherever you are sitting, just clap for them. We're so excited to have them join the board. 3 fantastic board members to add to our already pretty amazing board. So thank you. And now, Beth, over to you to
Yeah.
acknowledge a few people that we're losing.
Yes. So Marguerite had the, good part of it, getting to introduce our 3 new board members who I'm thrilled to have joined the board. And I say the good part because I get the sad part. I have to say goodbye to 2 board members who have been extraordinary contributors to the organization. So first, I want to acknowledge Kerry Armistead. Kerry has served on the board for 2 terms or 6 years. He brought his passion, his legal expertise, and his commitment to long-term financial health to YWCA. Kerry chaired the governance committee for many years, moving us towards the diverse board we are today. Kerry also served on our real estate committee, helping to assess the best future for 140 Clarendon Street. Kerry, we are so grateful for all you have brought to YWCA. Your commitment to the mission, attention to detail, and your focus on organizational sustainability has made an enormous difference to the current and future of YWCA. And Jessica Early. Jessica's 3 years on the board have been very busy. She has served on the Fund Development Committee and co-chaired the Academy of Women Achievers Host Committee for the past 3 years. Always ready to be creative and find resources and solutions. Jessica, a busy partner in a law firm and mother of 3 young boys, which during COVID-19 brings along additional roles and responsibilities, had a 3rd full-time job with her work at YWCA. Jessica, we thank you for your time and energy, all of your hard work for making AWA the important event it is for YW and the community, and for seeing us through this first and hopefully last virtual Academy of Women Achievers event. We have a gift that we will send to each of you as a small token of our appreciation. And again, I just want to say on behalf of the board of YW and certainly the staff and the leadership team, thank you for your service on our board. And with that, I want to thank everybody for attending our annual meeting this year. Our final slide includes links to sign up for our monthly leader and for donating. If you haven't made your donation, remember you get that YW face mask. And if you have contributed, we again want to thank you for partnering with us in this work. And to our board members, I will see you in about 15 minutes to start our board meeting. Thank you again so much and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.